Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to electrify your understanding
Electrify?
of the law.
Okay, I was worried you were going to make us dissect a Tesla.
No, no, no. Although, that's not a bad idea for our next deep dive.
Let's put a pin in that. What are we diving into today?
Battery.
Ah, the Tort, not the Duracell.
You got it. We're going to unpack this surprisingly nuanced area of the law because, believe it or not, it comes up more often than you might think.
It does, and it gets at something really fundamental. Personal boundaries. You know that feeling when someone invades your space and it just feels off?
Yeah, like you instinctively want to step back.
Exactly. Battery law is all about that space, that sense of personal autonomy we all have. When those lines get crossed, legally speaking, that's when things get interesting.
So let's get right to it. Most people probably think of battery as something out of an action movie, fistfights and brawls. But legally speaking, what does it actually mean?
Legally, it's defined as intentional, harmful, or offensive contact with another person.
Okay, so far so good. But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Right. The key here is without their consent. See, it's not just about someone bumping into you on a crowded train platform. It's about actions that go beyond what's considered acceptable in a given situation. It's about a lack of consent, and that can get tricky.
I bet. So it's not just a shove, it's not just a poke, it's about that element of consent.
Precisely.
What about intent? How much of a factor is that? I mean, if you accidentally bump into someone.
That's where things get even more interesting. Legally, intent is focused on the act of making contact, not necessarily on wanting to cause harm. Like you could totally see how a harmless prank, if it involves unwanted contact, could land someone in legal hot water.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I'm remembering a case, Cole versus Hibbert, I think it was. This woman playfully kicked her friend.
Oh, yeah, and ended up causing an injury.
Yeah, and the court decided it was battery?
It really highlights how tricky this idea of intent can be. Just because you didn't mean to cause serious harm doesn't mean you're off the hook. And that's especially true if your actions end up having real, often unforeseen consequences.
Okay, so I'm definitely rethinking every time I've ever playfully nudged someone. But you also mentioned offensive contact earlier. How does the law define what crosses the line into offensive territory? It seems incredibly subjective.
Well, the law gets that unwanted touch can be offensive even if it doesn't leave a mark. It boils down to violating someone's personal space and their bodily autonomy. Like, imagine someone touching your hair without asking.
Yeah.
Not cool.
Yeah.
It might not be painful, but it can definitely feel like a huge invasion.
Absolutely. It's about respecting those invisible boundaries we all have. But how in the world do courts determine when an action has crossed that line? Like, is there some kind of legal measuring stick for personal space?
That's where the reasonable person standard comes in. The courts ask, would a reasonable person in that situation find the contact offensive?
A reasonable person?
Easier said than done, right? Because what's considered reasonable can be up for interpretation, and that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with societal norms and how those are constantly shifting.
It's like trying to write a legal definition for awkward, right?
But it gets at something really important about the law.
Yeah.
It's not some abstract thing. It's about real people, real situations. And the courts have to figure out how to apply these principles to those messy, sometimes awkward situations.
Exactly. So there must be some real-world cases that illustrate how this whole reasonable person standard plays out in court.
Oh, absolutely. And they often involve situations that make you stop and think, I never considered that. Like, take the case of Paul versus Holbrook. In this case, this woman is at work just doing her thing
Okay.
when a former boss of hers approaches her and starts massaging her shoulders.
Oh, yeah. I can see where this is going. Not good.
Exactly. And the court agreed. Even though a shoulder massage might seem harmless in some contexts, like between friends, in this particular situation, it was deemed offensive. Why? Well, because it involved unwanted physical contact from someone in a position of power, clearly overstepping professional boundaries.
So even something as seemingly innocuous as a touch, depending on the power dynamics at play, the context,
It can be deeply offensive.
can be a completely different story.
Exactly. And it shows just how critical context is when applying the reasonable person standard. It's not just about the act itself, it's about all the factors surrounding it. It's about understanding those subtle cues and unspoken rules that govern how we interact with each other.
Which brings us back to Vosburgh versus Putney, that schoolyard kick that took a bit of an unexpected turn.
Oh yeah, good old Vosburgh. Classic.
Can you remind us about what happened there?
So you've got these two kids, just messing around at school, right? And one of them gives the other a light kick in the shin. Seems like typical schoolyard stuff, right?
Yeah, kids being kids.
Except, here's the thing. The boy who got kicked had this pre-existing medical condition. And that little kick, it aggravated the condition, leading to way more serious harm than anyone could have foreseen.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences. So, a seemingly harmless kick snowballs into something much bigger. What happened in court? Did the kid who did the kicking get off easy since no one knew about the pre-existing injury?
That's where the eggshell skull rule comes in.
The eggshell skull, I've never heard of that one.
Get ready, because it's a bit of a legal head-scratcher, pun intended.
Okay, hit me with it.
Yeah.
What is the eggshell skull rule?
It basically means you take your victim as you find them.
Meaning?
Meaning, even if the person who made the contact had absolutely no way of knowing about the pre-existing condition, they're still on their toes for the full extent of the harm caused by their actions.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack. So even if the outcome was completely unforeseen, the person who initiated the contact is still held responsible.
You got it. And look, I know it might seem unfair at first glance, but when you think about it, it makes sense. We can't expect everyone to walk around with X-ray vision knowing all our hidden vulnerabilities, right? The law has to draw a line somewhere to protect people from bearing the full weight of those unforeseen consequences.
That makes sense.
It speaks to this fundamental idea that we have a responsibility to be mindful of how our actions, even seemingly small ones, can ripple out and impact others. It's about recognizing that we don't always have the full picture.
Absolutely. Vosberg v. Putney really drives that point home.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about intent, we've talked about offensive contact, and now this whole eggshell skull thing. It feels like we're really starting to uncover all the layers of complexity when it comes to this idea of battery. It's a lot more than meets the eye. You know, it is kind of like you said at the beginning about this idea that we all have this protective zone around us, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a tangible thing.
Invisible force field.
But it's there. And understanding battery law, it's not just about memorizing legal jargon. It's about being aware of those zones, both our own and those of the people around us.
It really is. It's about bringing a sense of awareness to those everyday interactions, like a pat on the back,
Right.
or handshake.
Squeezing past someone on a crowded sidewalk.
Exactly. All those moments. Most of the time it's fine. We navigate them without even thinking. But what we've been talking about, understanding even just the basics of battery, it gives you this whole other layer of awareness of those interactions. It's about recognizing and respecting each other's physical autonomy, even in those little, seemingly insignificant ways.
Right. And that's a really powerful idea, I think. This isn't about walking on eggshells, afraid to make any contact for fear of a lawsuit.
No, not at all.
It's about something bigger than that.
It's about cultivating a deeper sense of consideration and respect for each other.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of battery, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think the big one is to remember that battery, it's not just about those clear-cut cases of someone trying to cause harm.
Right.
It's a lot broader than that. It covers a much wider range of situations, from those accidental bumps to a touch that's just plain offensive. And the law, it's constantly evolving, trying to keep pace with how our understanding of personal space and boundaries is changing.
And we've really seen those nuances play out today as we've talked, from the complexities of intent to those unexpected consequences, that whole eggshell skull principle. It's definitely been, well, electrifying to unpack it all.
I'll admit, I'm a little relieved we didn't have to open up a Tesla for this one.
Maybe next time. But seriously, folks, I hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. We've explored this idea of consent, those blurry lines of intent, and how the law works to protect that fundamental right we all have to our own personal space.
And how those seemingly small, everyday interactions, they matter because they shape how we relate to each other, how we move through the world.
Absolutely. To all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on another deep dive. Until next time.